When Sarah's uncle discovered she was pregnant, he didn't ask who the father was. He just threw her in the back of his buckboard and rode hard across the scorching Nevada desert to trade her like livestock. The heat was merciless, the sun beating down on the cracked earth as they traveled deeper into mining territory. But the man he gave her to wasn't what anyone expected. Henry Bigfoot Hunter stood 6 feet 5 inches tall in his worn leather vest, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the desert whole. The nickname came from his size 15 boots and the tracks he left that spooked even seasoned trackers, though some whispered it was because he'd been raised by mountain folk who knew things about the wilderness that civilized men preferred not to believe. His Winchester rifle rested easy in his enormous hands, and his pale blue eyes held the distant look of a man who'd spent more time talking to trees than people. He didn't speak when Sarah's uncle arrived at the abandoned mining camp, just pointed to the log cabin that served as his quarters, then walked back toward the creek like she was no different from the sack of supplies her uncle had left him along with her. Sarah stood there in the blazing heat, her wrists still red from the rope burn, her eyes swollen from crying through the 3-day journey. Her uncle hadn't given her a final word, only a grunt of disgust. Then he rode off back down the dusty trail without looking back, leaving a cloud of red dust hanging in the air like a curse. She was barely 18, her shoes worn through from walking behind the wagon when it got stuck, belly beginning to swell beneath her faded blue dress, and now left in the middle of the desert with a giant of a man who looked like he could snap her in half without effort but hadn't said a single word. The heavy wooden door of the cabin creaked open. Cool shade beckoned from within, promising relief from the punishing sun that had already burned her arms raw during the endless ride. Inside, the thick log walls kept out the worst of the heat. The room was sparse but surprisingly clean. A large bed in one corner covered with a patchwork quilt, a rough pine table that looked handmade, a water basin with wildflowers floating in it, pegs on the wall hung with hunting gear and traps that spoke of a man who lived entirely off the land. A massive Sharps rifle propped against the wall, its barrel gleaming with careful maintenance. Then she turned around, expecting to find him watching her, but he was gone. Sarah stepped in slowly, her worn shoes silent on the swept wooden floor. The door shut behind her with a solid thud that seemed to echo in the sudden stillness. She sank down onto a 3-legged stool beside the table, clutching her arms around her middle, feeling the first real relief from the son's assault she'd known in days. Her uncle hadn't asked who the father was. He hadn't asked anything. Just appeared at her boarding house room at dawn a week ago, dragged her out while she was still in her nightgown, and stuffed her into the wagon like she was cargo. "Your shame brings dishonor to our family name," he'd snarled through clenched teeth, his breath reeking of whiskey and moral superiority. "You'll live with your sin in the wilderness where it belongs, or die with it. I won't have your disgrace contaminating decent society another day." The ride had been torment, days through the brutal heat with barely any food, water rationed like liquid gold, no privacy for basic needs. Only dust that filled her mouth and nose until she could barely breathe, the relentless jolting of the wagon wheels over rocks and ruts, and the sound of her own heart breaking in her ears as everything she'd ever known disappeared behind them in a haze of heat and condemnation. Now the only sound was the wind sighing through the pine trees that clustered around this hidden valley and the distant sound of his boots on the wooden porch outside. She pressed her back against the cool log wall and tried to think of what came next, but her mind felt as empty as the desert they'd crossed to get here. He came back as the sun was setting, painting the sky red as spilled blood across the western mountains. Even taller than she remembered from that brief exchange at the creek, shoulders so broad they seemed to block out half the doorway, wearing buckskin pants and a cotton shirt that had seen better decades. Pale skin weathered by years of mountain living, a thick brown beard that reached nearly to his chest, eyes like winter sky that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. He glanced at her once, just once, through the doorway where she sat huddled on the stool, then walked to the outdoor fire pit and started preparing a trout he'd caught during whatever mysterious business had occupied his afternoon. She watched him through the open door as he worked. His movements were efficient, practiced. The motions of a man who'd lived alone for so long that civilization had become a foreign concept. He cleaned the fish with the same methodical precision she imagined he used to service his weapons, each cut deliberate and waste-free. She stared at him through the doorway, this stranger who now controlled her fate. He didn't glance back, didn't acknowledge her presence, seemed content to let the silence stretch between them like the endless sky itself. Finally, her voice cracked through the still air. "What's your name?" He didn't look up from his work. The fish was nearly ready now, his knife blade catching the last rays of sunlight. "Henry Hunter. Most folks call me Bigfoot." Just that, flat and matter-of-fact. Then silence again, thick and awkward in the cooling mountain air. No explanation of the nickname, no attempt at conversation, nothing to bridge the vast distance between them. Her fingers trembled in her lap as she gathered courage for the next question. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Still no eye contact. He arranged the cleaned fish over the fire he'd built, the flames casting dancing shadows across his bearded features. "I didn't ask for you," he muttered, finally breaking the silence. "Your uncle owed me for guide work. 3 months of leading his mining expedition through the Sierra Nevada. Said this was payment for the debt." The words hit like a physical blow. Sarah felt the sting spread through her chest, but she bit down on her lower lip until she tasted copper. She'd cried enough that first night when her uncle had called her names she'd never forget. She wouldn't give this stranger the satisfaction of seeing her tears now. She slept on a pile of furs near the fireplace that first night, her body curled protectively around her swelling belly. He hadn't offered the bed and she didn't dare take it without permission. Through the small window, she could see stars scattered across the mountain sky like scattered diamonds, more stars than she'd ever seen back in the mining towns where the lights of civilization dimmed their brightness. Her hands curved around her belly where the baby grew, still small, still secret except for the slight swell that her loose dress mostly hid. She felt the tiny fluttering inside her that didn't come from hunger or fear but from the new life taking shape in the darkness of her womb. It was the only thing she had left now, the only thing that belonged completely to her. The child of a moment's desperate loneliness with a traveling merchant who'd promised her marriage and given her nothing but shame when she told him the news. The next few days passed in sweltering heat and crushing silence. Bigfoot left before dawn on foot, disappearing into the wilderness with the silent grace of someone who'd learned to move like the wild things he hunted. He returned after dark, always with game or medicinal plants gathered from secret places in the mountains. She never saw where he went during the long hours between, only heard the whisper of his footsteps on pine needles as he departed, the occasional crack of his rifle echoing off canyon walls when he brought down an elk or deer, the cry of eagles circling overhead in the merciless blue sky. He never touched her, never asked questions about her condition or her past, didn't even look at her for more than a few seconds at a time. Sarah cleaned the cabin because she didn't know what else to do with herself in the endless hours of solitude. She cooked what little she could over the outdoor fire, though her hands were clumsy from lack of practice. Her uncle had kept her confined to sewing and mending back in town, said that outdoor work was man's business and she was too delicate and useless for it anyway. The isolation was worse than the heat. Days would pass with no words exchanged between them beyond the basic necessities, woods running low, or storm coming from the north. She found herself talking to the baby growing inside her, whispering stories and songs her mother had once sung, just to hear a human voice in the endless quiet. It was on the 7th morning, when the heat was already shimmering off the rocks before the sun had fully risen, that she saw the blood. Dark stains on her nightgown when she woke, spreading panic through her chest like wildfire. Her scream brought him running from outside where he'd been splitting firewood, axe still in hand and eyes scanning for mountain lions or bears. "I'm bleeding," she whispered, her voice shrill with terror. "It's too early. I can't lose. I don't know what to do." He moved faster than she'd thought possible for such a large man, tossed the axe aside without thought, came to her side and looked once at the spreading stain. Then he swept her up in his massive arms like she weighed nothing and carried her to the bed without asking permission or making explanations. She lay there shivering despite the rising heat, whispering the same prayer over and over like a broken record. "Please not the baby. Please not the baby. Please don't take the baby too." Bigfoot didn't speak, just built up the fire with quick, economical movements, boiled water in his iron pot until it steamed, then brought every fur and blanket in the cabin to cover her trembling form. She saw his hands shake once, just once, as he checked the bleeding with the careful precision of a man who'd tended wounded animals, who knew the difference between bleeding that would stop and bleeding that wouldn't. The hours crawled by like wounded animals. The blood slowed gradually, then stopped. The cramping that had seized her belly like an iron fist began to ease. She didn't lose the baby, though for several terrifying hours she'd been certain she would. He sat beside her that night on the floor, his back against the wall, watching the fire with a face she couldn't read in the flickering light. His rifle lay within easy reach, his boots still on, ready for whatever danger the night might bring. "You cared," she whispered into the darkness. He didn't blink, didn't turn to look at her. "Don't read more into it than there is, girl." But his voice cracked when he said it, and she heard something underneath the words that he'd probably die before admitting aloud. She didn't say anything else. Just listened to the crackle of pine wood burning and the soft, steady rhythm of his breathing. The man who hadn't smiled once since she'd arrived, who spoke to her like she was a burden he hadn't asked for, had carried her like something precious and sat beside her all night, guarding her rest like a faithful dog. By the third week, she started to notice things about him that the silence had hidden before. Small gestures that spoke louder than words ever could. A second tin plate placed beside his at meals, even though he never offered it directly. A soft deer hide left folded near the fireplace, new, carefully prepared, but placed there where she could reach it if the mountain nights grew cold. Her worn shoes, which had been falling apart from the rocky terrain, suddenly replaced with moccasins made from supple leather, crafted during one of his mysterious absences without fanfare or explanation. He wasn't cruel to her, never raised his voice, never threatened or struck her, never made demands or approached her sleeping area. But he wasn't kind either, in any way she understood kindness. He was something else entirely, something as unreadable and complex as the mountain wilderness itself. Harsh but not heartless, distant but not absent, carrying his own wounds with the same stoic endurance he brought to everything else. He'd gone from a man who spoke only when absolutely necessary to one who left kindness in his silence. Then came the morning that changed everything between them. She woke to the sound of gunshots echoing through the valley. They appeared like heat mirages at first, shimmering figures on horseback along the rocky ridge that overlooked their hidden camp. But Bigfoot's entire body changed the moment he spotted them, his hand dropping instinctively to his sidearm, his eyes scanning the tree-line with the practiced alertness of a man who'd survived in hostile territory for too many years to count. "Get inside," he said quietly, his voice carrying unmistakable authority. "Stay low against the back wall. Don't make a sound, don't show yourself at the window. Whatever you hear out here, don't come out until I tell you it's safe." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself against the thick log wall farthest from the door, listening to the sound of horses circling their cabin like wolves around prey. She could hear Bigfoot's deep voice speaking calmly to the intruders, words she couldn't quite make out but whose tone spoke of negotiation rather than threat, of someone trying to avoid violence rather than provoke it. The conversation lasted over an hour, voices rising and falling in a rhythm that suggested serious discussion rather than immediate danger. When it was finally over and the sound of horses had faded back into the mountain silence, Bigfoot came inside. His shirt was dark with sweat, and his hands shook slightly as he set down his rifle. "What did they want?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To know if I was keeping a white woman here against her will," he said, still not looking directly at her. "To know if you were a captive or a companion." She stared at him, trying to process the implications. "What did you tell them?" "Told them you were under my protection. Told them you were carrying a child and needed shelter until it was born." He paused, finally meeting her eyes. "Told them you'd chosen to be here. And they believed you?" For the first time since she'd known him, something like a smile ghosted across his bearded lips. Mountain men respect women who are with child above almost everything else. They won't bother us as long as you're expecting and as long as they believe you're here by choice. "And after the baby comes?" The smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. "We'll figure that out when we get there." That night, she sat on the edge of the bed instead of on the furs by the fire. He didn't stop her, didn't comment, just went about his evening routine of cleaning his weapons and checking their supplies. When she cried, silent, slow, ashamed tears for everything she'd lost and everything she feared losing still, he didn't speak or try to comfort her. But he didn't leave either. He just sat in the darkness across the room, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of her emotions. It was during the 8th week of her stay that the fever came, striking her down like a rattlesnake's bite. She woke drenched in sweat despite the pre-dawn chill, her teeth chattering uncontrollably, the world spinning around her like a dust devil. Bigfoot's massive hand was on her forehead before she could call his name, his touch surprisingly gentle for such calloused fingers. He said nothing about the heat radiating from her skin or the way she shivered beneath every blanket they owned. He just saddled his horse in the gray dawn light and rode hard toward Virginia City, the nearest mining town with a proper doctor. The journey there and back would take 2 full days of hard riding through dangerous territory, leaving Sarah alone and defenseless in the mountain wilderness. But he went anyway. When he returned on the 2nd evening, his pale face was windburned and his lips were cracked from the desert heat, but he carried precious cargo in his saddlebags. Medicine in small brown bottles, clean white cloth for bandages, and something bitter in a silver flask that made her sleep deep and dreamless when the fever threatened to consume her completely. He nursed her through 4 days of delirium, forcing water and medicine down her throat when she was too weak to swallow, bathing her burning skin with cool cloths, changing her sweat-soaked clothes with the clinical efficiency of someone who'd tended wounded animals while carefully preserving her modesty. When she woke on the 5th morning, the fever had finally broken. Bigfoot looked worse than she felt, gaunt from missed meals, his eyes dark with worry and exhaustion, stubble covering his usually neat beard. She whispered hoarsely, "Why'd you come back?" He blinked at her from where he sat carving what looked like a wooden spoon, nervous hands needing something to occupy them. She tried to smile through her cracked lips. "You could have let the fever do the work your conscience wouldn't. Could have told anyone who asked that I wandered off into the wilderness and got lost. Nobody would have questioned it." He didn't laugh at her dark humor, just shook his head once with something that might have been anger. "I'm not your uncle, girl. I don't abandon what's under my protection." That was all he said, but it was enough to plant something small and fragile in the wasteland of her heart. The seasons in the mountains changed more dramatically than anywhere Sarah had ever lived. There was blazing summer heat that made the rocks too hot to touch, golden autumn days when the aspens turned the mountainsides into sheets of living fire, bitter winter cold that froze water solid in minutes, and wild spring weather that brought flash floods and avalanches with equal unpredictability. But Sarah learned to read the land's moods, to see beauty in the harsh geometry of stone and sky, to find comfort in the vast wilderness that had once terrified her. Bigfoot was gone longer each day now, checking his trap lines and hunting the game that kept them fed through the harsh seasons. He tracked deer and elk through the high country, set snares for rabbits and prairie dogs, sometimes disappeared for days at a time pursuing rumors of mountain lions that were threatening the scattered mining camps. The work was solitary and dangerous, each day bringing the possibility that he might not return. Sarah found herself listening for the sound of his footsteps each evening, relief flooding through her when she finally heard them approaching through the pine trees. Her belly grew steadily, a slow bloom beneath the folds of her cotton dress that had once belonged to her mother. Bigfoot never mentioned her changing condition directly, never asked how she was feeling or when the baby might come. But Sarah saw the glances when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his eyes would drop to her middle when she moved too quickly or reached too high for something. She saw how he began bringing back extra meat from his hunting trips, not just the single rabbit that would feed them both, but venison that he'd smoke and preserve for the harder times ahead. He'd never say it aloud, wouldn't know how to form the words, but Sarah saw it in a dozen small gestures. In the way he showed her which mountain plants were safe to eat and which would poison her. In the wooden bowls and utensils he carved from pine and left on the table without explanation. In the way he'd started sleeping on the floor near the door, his rifle always within arm's reach, positioning himself between her and whatever dangers the wilderness might bring. He'd gone from a man who spoke only when survival required it to one who left kindness in his silence. One evening, as the sun painted the log walls gold and amber, Sarah gathered her courage and asked the question that had been burning in her mind for weeks. "Were you ever married, Bigfoot? He froze in the act of pouring coffee into his tin cup, the dark liquid steaming in the cooling air. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without looking up from the fire, he spoke a single word. Once. The silence that followed was different from their usual quiet. This one ached with old wounds and carefully buried grief. "What happened?" she asked softly. "Consumption," he said, his voice flat as hammered iron. "Took her slow. Took the baby with her when she went." Winter of '68, up in the Montana territories. Sarah felt her breath catch. "I'm sorry." He shrugged, but she could see the tension in his massive shoulders, the way his hands gripped the coffee cup like it was the only thing keeping him anchored. "Long time ago. Doesn't make it hurt less." He looked at her then, really looked at her, for the first time since she'd arrived. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, maybe, or just the recognition that they'd both lost things that couldn't be replaced. "No," he said quietly. "It doesn't." That night, Sarah dreamed of a woman with gentle eyes and patient hands, holding a baby that never got the chance to grow up. She woke with tears on her cheeks, though she couldn't say if they were for Bigfoot's lost family or for the uncertain future of her own. The miners came again 3 weeks later, but this time they weren't testing boundaries or making threats. This time they came seeking help, led by a grizzled prospector whose face was mapped with the lines of a hard life lived in pursuit of elusive fortune. He spoke to Bigfoot with the respectful tone of someone asking a favor from a man whose capabilities were well known. "Henry," he said, removing his hat as he approached their cabin, "we got trouble up at the Comstock claim. Cave-in trapped 2 men, and the shaft's too unstable for regular rescue work." Bigfoot nodded slowly, already reaching for his specialized equipment. "How long they been down?" "Day and a half. We can hear them calling, but every time we try to dig them out, more rock comes down." Sarah stood in the doorway, clutching her shawl around her shoulders, watching this exchange with growing understanding. These men had ridden hard through dangerous country to ask Bigfoot for help because he possessed skills that no one else in the territory could match. "I'll need rope, timber for shoring, and at least 4 men who can follow orders without question," Bigfoot said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life or death decisions. "Whatever you need," the prospector assured him. "We'll pay standard rates plus bonus if you bring them out alive." Bigfoot glanced back at Sarah, and she saw the conflict in his pale eyes. He couldn't leave her alone for the days this rescue would require, but he also couldn't ignore men who might die without his help. "I'll be fine," she said, though the thought of being alone in the wilderness terrified her. "Save them." That night, after Bigfoot had left with the rescue party, Sarah learned what true solitude meant. Every sound in the darkness, the hoot of an owl, the snap of a breaking branch, the distant howl of wolves, sent her heart racing. She kept the fire burning high and held his backup rifle across her knees, though she'd never fired a gun in her life. He returned on the 3rd evening, his clothes filthy with mine dust and dried blood, exhaustion written in every line of his massive frame. But both trapped miners were alive, and the rescue had earned him a reputation that would spread throughout the territory. "Why'd you do it?" Sarah asked as he cleaned the cuts and scrapes that covered his hands and arms. "Risk your life for strangers?" He winced as she dabbed iodine on a particularly deep gash. "Because I could. Because they needed help and I had the skills to provide it." "That's not a complete answer." Bigfoot was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I've spent 10 years running from civilization, telling myself I was better off alone. But maybe..." He paused, searching for words that didn't come easily. "Maybe it's time I used what I know to help instead of just survive." The baby chose that moment to kick, a strong flutter that made Sarah gasp and press her hand to her belly. Bigfoot's eyes followed the movement, and something shifted in his expression. Surprise, wonder, something almost like longing. "Can you feel it moving?" he asked, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "All the time now." She looked down at her hands spread across her swollen middle. "Like it's already trying to fight its way into the world." "Sounds about right," he said, and this time when he almost smiled, it reached his eyes. That night, for the first time since she'd arrived, they sat together by the fire instead of maintaining their careful distance. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that the space between them felt companionable rather than hostile. Bigfoot worked on a new pair of snowshoes while Sarah mended a tear in his spare shirt, their hands busy with familiar tasks while the mountain wilderness settled into its nighttime stillness around them. "Tell me about your wife," Sarah said suddenly, then immediately regretted the boldness. But instead of shutting down the way he usually did when she asked personal questions, Bigfoot was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Her name was Mary," he said finally, his knife pausing in its work on the ashwood frame. "Met her in a logging camp up in Montana. She was cooking for the crew, keeping 20 men fed and healthy through a winter that killed half the horses." "How did you meet?" "Avalanche," he said, and there was warmth in his voice now, a gentleness that transformed his harsh features. "Buried 3 men, including me. She dug us out with her bare hands and nursed us back to health in a one-room shack with no supplies and no help." Sarah watched his face in the firelight, seeing a man she'd never glimpsed before. "What was she like?" "Tougher than me in all the ways that mattered." His knife resumed its careful shaping of the wood. "Smart as a whip too. Could read sign like an Indian scout and cook food that'd make angels weep with joy. She's the one taught me to carve." He held up the half-finished snowshoe. "Said I had good hands for creating things instead of just destroying them." "Did she want children?" The knife stilled again. "More than anything. We tried for 2 years before." His voice trailed off, and Sarah saw the familiar mask of stoicism slide back over his features. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "She got pregnant once," he continued, as if he hadn't heard her. "Made it 6 months before the consumption took hold. Doc said the disease weakened her too much to carry the baby safely. Lost them both within a week." He set down the carving, his massive hands clasping together in his lap. "Buried them under a pine tree on a hill overlooking the valley where we'd planned to build our homestead." Sarah felt tears burning her eyes. "Oh, Henry. Left Montana the day after the funeral," he said, his voice steady again but hollow. "Figured if I was going to die anyway, might as well die in country where nobody knew what I'd lost." They sat in silence after that, the fire crackling between them and the vast mountain night stretching endlessly beyond their small circle of light. Sarah understood now why he'd been so careful with her during the bleeding scare, why his hands had shaken when he'd thought she might lose the baby. She understood the weight he carried, the fear that ran deeper than any mine cave-in. "I'm not her," Sarah said quietly. He looked at her, confusion flickering across his features. "I'm not Mary. This baby isn't the one you lost. You can't save them by saving us." Bigfoot stared into the fire for a long time before responding. "I know that. Do you?" He was quiet for another minute, turning the half-finished snowshoe over in his large hands. "Maybe not entirely," he admitted. "But I know you're here now. And I know I want you to stay." The honesty in his voice made her breath catch. "Even though I was traded to you like livestock? Even though I come with all this trouble? Especially because of that." He met her eyes across the firelight. "Nobody should be thrown away like you were. Nobody should have to face what's coming alone." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been locked away since the morning her uncle had dragged her from her bed. It wasn't love, not yet, maybe not ever. But it was trust, tentative and fragile as a mountain flower, beginning to take root in the most unlikely soil. "I want to stay too," she whispered. The words hung between them like a promise neither was quite ready to make but both desperately needed to hear. For weeks later, a supply wagon arrived at their hidden valley, bringing mail and news from the outside world that felt increasingly distant and unreal. The driver was a weathered mountain man named Cookie Wilson who'd been hauling supplies to remote camps longer than anyone could remember. He took one look at Sarah's obvious condition and raised his eyebrows but said nothing beyond pleasantries about the weather and mining activity. Among the supplies was a letter addressed to Bigfoot in a man's careful handwriting. Sarah watched his face change as he read it, saw color drain from his weathered features. "Bad news?" she asked. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside his shirt pocket. "My brother in Oregon. Says my pa's dying. Wants me to come home before." He trailed off. Sarah felt her world tilt sideways. How long would you be gone? Month, maybe more. Depends on travel and... He gestured vaguely, unable to finish the thought. You have to go, she said, though the words felt like swallowing glass. I can't leave you here alone. Not with the baby coming so soon. How soon do you think? Sarah asked, looking down at her swollen belly. Bigfoot studied her with the same careful attention he used when tracking wounded animals. 6 weeks, maybe less. First babies can be unpredictable. The impossibility of the situation settled over them like mountain fog. He couldn't leave her alone to give birth in the middle of nowhere, but he also couldn't miss his father's final days. And there was no one else, no other option in this vast wilderness they called home. That night, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to Bigfoot pace restlessly outside. Through the small window, she could see his silhouette moving back and forth like a caged bear, stopping occasionally to stare toward the west where Oregon lay beyond the horizon. In the morning, she made her decision. I'm coming with you, she announced as he prepared his morning coffee. Bigfoot nearly dropped the pot. Sarah, no. The journey alone would be hard enough, but in your condition. I've survived everything else, she interrupted. I can survive a wagon ride. It's not just a wagon ride. It's 3 weeks across territory where every mile could bring trouble. Claim jumpers, road agents, miners who might not take kindly to seeing us together. And if the baby comes early, then you'll help me, same as you would here. She stood up, steadying herself against the table. I won't let you face your father's death alone. Not after everything you've done for me. Bigfoot stared at her for a long moment, something like amazement flickering across his weathered features. You do that? Travel across half the continent to sit with a dying man you've never met. He raised the man who saved my life, Sarah said simply. That makes him family. It took them 5 days to prepare for the journey. Bigfoot traded some of his prime furs for a sturdy wagon and a pair of mules that could handle the long haul. He gathered supplies with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. Water barrels, medical kit, extra ammunition, food that would keep in the heat, canvas for shelter, tools for repairs. Everything they might need to survive 3 weeks on roads that were little more than animal tracks through hostile territory. Sarah packed her few belongings in a single bag, including the wooden animals Bigfoot had carved during their long evenings together. She wrapped them carefully in her spare dress, these small tokens that had somehow become precious to her. They were proof that beauty could exist even in the harshest places, that gentle hands could create as well as destroy. On the morning they were scheduled to leave, Sarah woke to find Bigfoot standing outside in the pre-dawn darkness, staring back at the cabin that had been his home for 5 years. His face was unreadable in the gray light, but she could see the weight of leaving in the set of his shoulders. Second thoughts? She asked softly. This was the first place I felt peace since Mary died, he said without turning around. Hard to walk away from peace. Sarah moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his in the growing light. Maybe we can take it with us. His fingers closed around hers, strong and warm and steady. Maybe we can. The journey west was everything Bigfoot had warned her it would be and worse. The wagon wheels found every rut and rock on the poorly maintained roads, jarring Sarah's increasingly unwieldy body until her teeth ached from clenching them against the constant discomfort. The sun was merciless during the day, the mountain cold was bitter at night, and water was always scarce despite their careful rationing. But there were moments of unexpected beauty too. Sunrises that painted the entire sky in shades of rose and gold. Mountain wildflowers that bloomed in impossible abundance after brief thunderstorms. The sight of wild mustangs running free across high meadows, their manes flying like banners in the wind. Most surprisingly, there were moments of something that felt almost like happiness. The evening when Bigfoot taught her to read weather signs, his patient voice explaining how mountain folk predicted storms and seasonal changes. The morning when they woke to find their camp visited by a family of deer, the graceful animals watching them with curious dark eyes before bounding away like spirits. The night when Sarah felt the baby move so strongly that Bigfoot could see the kicks from across their small campfire, his eyes widening with wonder at this evidence of the life growing between them. They encountered other travelers on the road, mining crews heading to new strikes, families seeking opportunities in California, drifters and dreamers pursuing rumors of easy wealth. Some stared openly at the sight of the giant mountain man and pregnant woman traveling together, but most were too focused on their own journeys to spare much attention for strangers. It was near the California-Oregon border that they met the missionaries. The couple approached their evening camp with the careful politeness of people who'd learned to read danger in unfamiliar faces. The man was middle-aged, built like a lumberjack, with calloused hands and eyes that held the patient kindness of someone who'd spent his life serving others. His wife was small and neat, her graying hair pinned back severely but her smile genuine as she took in Sarah's obvious condition. "Evening, folks," the man called out when he was still 20 feet away, close enough to talk but far enough to retreat if necessary. "Name's Reverend Thomas Mitchell. This is my wife, Ruth. We're heading to Oregon City to establish a new congregation." Bigfoot's hand stayed near his rifle, but his voice was civil. "Henry Hunter. This is Sarah." Ruth's eyes lingered on Sarah's swollen belly with the practiced assessment of a woman who'd helped deliver babies in frontier conditions. "How far along, dear?" "About 7 months," Sarah replied, unconsciously placing a protective hand over her middle. "First baby?" Sarah nodded, suddenly aware of how young and unprepared she must look. "Well, you're traveling with good protection," Ruth said, glancing respectfully at Bigfoot's imposing frame. "Though I hope you're planning to be settled somewhere safe before your time comes." "Oregon," Bigfoot said simply. "Family business." The Reverend's expression grew sympathetic. "I'm sorry for whatever brings you home, friend. The roads to Oregon are hard enough without carrying grief." They shared a meal that evening, salt pork and beans supplemented by wild greens that Ruth knew how to identify and prepare. The conversation was careful but warm, touching on safe subjects like weather patterns and road conditions. Sarah found herself starving for female company after months of masculine silence, hanging on Ruth's stories about frontier life and the challenges of establishing churches in mining territories. "How long have you been married?" Ruth asked as they cleaned the dishes in creek water. Sarah felt her cheeks burn. "We're not. We aren't married." Ruth's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained kind. "Traveling companions, then?" "It's complicated," Sarah said, not knowing how to explain their arrangement without revealing the shameful details of how she'd come to be here. "Most important relationships are," Ruth replied gently. "The heart rarely follows the rules society tries to impose on it." That night, as they shared watch duties around the camp, Reverend Mitchell spoke quietly with Bigfoot about the challenges of traveling with a woman so close to her time. "I delivered babies in logging camps," the Reverend said. "Seen what can go wrong when there's no proper medical help available. You might want to consider staying in Sacramento or one of the larger towns until after the child comes." "Can't," Bigfoot replied. "My father may not have that long." The Reverend nodded thoughtfully. "Well, if you're determined to continue, I'd recommend picking up supplies in the next town. Clean cloth, whiskey for sterilizing, sharp knife. And pray you don't need any of it on the trail." The missionaries left at dawn, heading north toward their own destiny. Ruth pressed a small bundle into Sarah's hands before mounting her horse. Herbs for pain and bleeding, she explained, and a tiny knitted cap that had been meant for a grandchild who lived too far away to visit. "Take care of each other," she whispered, squeezing Sarah's hands. "I can see how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching." Sarah felt her heart skip. "How does he look at me?" Ruth smiled. "Like a man who's found something he didn't know he was looking for." After the missionaries disappeared over the next ridge, the wilderness felt even more vast and empty than before. But something had changed between Sarah and Bigfoot during that brief encounter with civilization. The careful distance they'd maintained for months had narrowed to something more intimate, though neither spoke of it directly. 2 days later, they reached the town of Placerville, a ramshackle collection of wooden buildings that had sprung up around a promising gold strike. The main street was ankle-deep in mud and horse manure, lined with saloons, supply stores, and boarding houses that catered to miners with more money than sense. Bigfoot left Sarah at the general store while he arranged for fresh supplies and had the wagon's wheels checked. She wandered the aisles, marveling at goods she hadn't seen in months: bolts of real fabric, glass jars filled with preserves, shoes that hadn't been cobbled together from animal hides. "When's the baby due?" asked the store clerk, a middle-aged woman with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "Soon," Sarah replied, not wanting to get into specifics with a stranger. "First one." Sarah nodded. "Well, you picked a hell of a time to be traveling," the woman said bluntly. "Roads between here and Oregon are rough, and there's been Indian trouble around the Rogue River Valley." Sarah's blood chilled. "What kind of trouble?" "Raids mostly. Settlers moving through their hunting grounds without permission. Nothing a man like your husband can't handle, I guess, but still something to be aware of." Sarah didn't correct the woman's assumption about their marital status. It was easier than explaining the truth, and she was starting to understand that frontier society operated by different rules than the civilized world she'd known. When Bigfoot returned, he was accompanied by the town doctor, a thin, nervous man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else than a mining boomtown. But his examination was thorough and professional, and his verdict was reassuring. "Baby's positioned correctly, heartbeat strong," he told them. "You're in excellent health considering the circumstances. I guess you have 3 to 4 weeks before labor begins." "Will we make it to Oregon in time?" Bigfoot asked. The doctor considered. "If you travel carefully and don't push too hard, yes. But have supplies ready for a birth on the trail, just in case. Nature doesn't always follow our schedules." They left Placerville with fresh supplies and renewed determination, following the increasingly treacherous roads that wound through the Sierra Nevada toward the Oregon territories. The mountain passes were spectacular but dangerous, narrow ledges carved into cliff faces, rushing streams that could sweep away an unwary traveler, sudden weather changes that could trap them in snow even during summer months. It was during their passage through a high mountain valley that Sarah's water broke. She felt the warm rush down her legs as they made camp for the evening, 3 weeks from Placerville and still 2 days from the nearest settlement. The contractions started an hour later, gentle at first, like the baby was just stretching, then building in intensity until she had to grip the wagon side to stay upright. "Bigfoot," she called, her voice tight with the effort of staying calm. He took one look at her pale face and the wet stains on her dress and understood immediately. No panic, no wasted motion, just the same focused efficiency he brought to every crisis. He had the wagon tongue unhitched and their shelter rigged in minutes, creating a private space behind canvas walls where Sarah could labor in relative comfort. The birth took 14 hours. 14 hours of pain that felt like being torn apart from the inside, of pushing against something that seemed impossible to overcome, of clutching Bigfoot's massive hands while he murmured encouragement in a voice steadier than her own heartbeat. He'd delivered calves and foals, helped wounded animals through difficult births during his years in the wilderness. But this was different. This was Sarah, and the baby they'd both come to think of as theirs despite the circumstances that had brought them together. When the baby finally emerged into the world, slippery and purple and wailing with outrage at being forced from the warm darkness of the womb, Bigfoot caught her in hands that had killed men and carved toys, that had built shelters and tended wounds and learned to be gentle when gentleness was needed most. "It's a girl," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't hide. Sarah reached for her daughter with shaking arms, tears streaming down her face as she cradled the tiny, perfect creature against her chest. The baby's cries softened to whimpers, then to the quiet, snuffling sounds of a child finding comfort in her mother's warmth. "She's beautiful," Sarah breathed, smoothing dark hair that was already showing a stubborn curl. Bigfoot cleaned and swaddled the baby with surprising skill, his enormous hands impossibly gentle as he wrapped her in soft cloth. "What will you name her?" Sarah looked up at him, this man who'd become so much more than her protector, who delivered her child in the middle of the wilderness and looked at the baby like she was a miracle instead of a burden. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." 3 days later, they rolled into Oregon City with a week-old baby and hearts full of questions about what came next. Bigfoot's family farm was another day's travel north, through timber country that reminded Sarah of fairy tales her mother had told her about enchanted forests and woodsmen who lived among the trees. The Hunter family homestead sat in a clearing surrounded by ancient Douglas firs, a solid log house with glass windows and a stone chimney that spoke of permanence and prosperity. Bigfoot's brother Samuel came out to meet them, followed by his wife and 3 children who stared wide-eyed at their legendary uncle and the woman traveling with him. Their father was indeed dying, consumption, the same disease that had taken Bigfoot's first wife and child. But he was still alert enough to hold baby Hope in his arms while Sarah and Bigfoot explained their situation to the assembled family. "So you're not married," said Samuel's wife, Martha, without judgment but with obvious curiosity. "No," Sarah admitted. "I was traded to Henry to settle a debt. But we've become—" She paused, searching for words to describe their relationship. "Partners," Bigfoot said quietly. "In everything that matters." The old man handed Hope back to Sarah and fixed his pale eyes, so like his son's, on Bigfoot's face. "Do you love her, boy?" Bigfoot was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands clasped in front of him. "More than I thought possible." "And you, girl?" the dying man asked Sarah. "Do you love my son?" Sarah looked at Bigfoot, this giant of a man who'd become her shelter in every storm, who'd delivered her baby with hands that shook with tenderness, who'd risked his life for strangers and carried her across a continent because she'd asked him to. "Yes," she whispered. "I do." The old man smiled, his first real smile in weeks. "Then what are you waiting for? Samuel here's ordained. Can marry you right now if you're willing." Sarah felt her heart stop. Marriage, real marriage, with vows and promises and the blessing of family. Not the arrangement they'd fallen into by necessity, but a choice made freely by 2 people who'd learned to see past their wounds to the possibility of healing together. "Sarah?" Bigfoot's voice was uncertain, vulnerable in a way she'd never heard before. She shifted Hope to one arm and reached for his hand with the other. "Yes," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Yes, I'll marry you." The wedding was simple, vows spoken in a circle of family around the old man's bedside, words of commitment and faithfulness and love that felt more real than any church ceremony Sarah could imagine. Bigfoot's voice shook when he promised to love and protect her and hope for all the days of his life. Sarah's voice was clear and strong when she vowed to stand beside him through whatever hardships lay ahead. When it was over, the old man closed his eyes and smiled. "Now I can die in peace," he whispered. He passed away 3 days later, holding Sarah's hand while Bigfoot sat beside him reading from the family Bible. His final words were about the granddaughter he'd never expected to meet and the son who'd finally found his way home. They buried him on a hill overlooking the valley where 4 generations of hunters had carved out their lives from the wilderness. As they stood beside the fresh grave, Hope sleeping peacefully in Sarah's arms, Bigfoot made a decision that surprised everyone. "We're staying," he announced. Samuel looked shocked. "But your life in Nevada?" "My life is here now," Bigfoot said, his arms circling Sarah's shoulders. "With my family." Sarah looked up at him, this man who'd traded his solitary existence for the complications and joys of love, who'd chosen them over the wilderness that had been his sanctuary for so long. "Are you sure?" she asked. Bigfoot gazed across the green valley where his father was buried, where his brother's children played in meadows dotted with wildflowers, where smoke rose from chimneys that promised warmth and permanence. "I spent 10 years running from life," he said quietly. "Time I started living it instead." That autumn, they built their own cabin on the far side of the family property, near a creek that sang over smooth stones and under trees that would protect them from winter storms. Bigfoot's hands, which had known only the work of survival, learned the craftsman's arts of building something meant to last. Sarah's hands, which had known only the domestic skills her uncle had deemed appropriate, learned to work beside him, holding timber while he notched joints, mixing mortar for the stone foundation, planning spaces for the larger family they both hoped they might someday have. Hope grew from a tiny bundle into a laughing baby who reached for her father's beard with determined fists and seemed to find magic in everything from sunbeams to falling leaves. Bigfoot carved her toys from pine and cedar, sang her lullabies in a deep voice that made the cabin walls resonate like a church bell, carried her on his shoulders when they walked through the forest so she could see the world from giant's height. Sarah learned to read his silences, to see the love he couldn't always express in words written in the careful way he banked their fire each night, in the fresh game he brought home to keep them fed, in the way he'd wake in the darkness when Hope cried and bring her to Sarah for nursing without complaint or comment. By the time Hope took her first steps, toddling across the cabin floor from her mother's arms to her father's outstretched hands, Sarah could hardly remember the frightened girl who'd been traded like livestock to a stranger in the desert. That girl had died somewhere on the trail west, replaced by a woman who knew her own strength, who'd learned that love could grow in the most unlikely soil, who discovered that family wasn't always about blood but sometimes about choosing to stand together against whatever the world might throw at them. On Hope's first birthday, they stood together on the porch of their cabin, watching their daughter chase fireflies in the meadow while the sun set behind the mountains. Sarah's hand rested in Bigfoot's, their fingers intertwined like the roots of trees that had grown together until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. "Do you ever miss it?" Sarah asked. "The solitude? The simplicity of being alone?" Bigfoot was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful attention he gave everything important. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I've learned something these past 2 years." "What's that?" He squeezed her hand, his pale eyes reflecting the last light of day. "A man can survive alone, but he can only truly live when he has something worth protecting, something worth building, something worth fighting for." "And do you?" Sarah asked softly. "Have something worth fighting for?" Bigfoot turned to look at her, this woman who'd been thrust into his life as payment for a debt but had become the answer to prayers he'd never known how to voice. Then he looked at Hope, giggling as she stumbled through the tall grass in pursuit of dancing lights, fearless and joyful in the way children were before the world taught them to be afraid. "Everything," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I have everything." As night settled over their valley and Hope fell asleep against her father's chest, Sarah understood that some stories didn't end with the dramatic gestures of novels or fairy tales. Some stories ended with quiet moments of contentment, with love that grew slowly like mountain trees, with the simple miracle of building something lasting from the broken pieces of 2 damaged lives. The desert that had once seemed like a place of exile had led them here, to this green valley where healing was possible and hope could grow into something as strong and enduring as the mountains themselves. Sarah had been traded away like livestock and found herself claimed instead by love, not the desperate, grasping kind that demanded possession, but the patient, steady kind that offered shelter and asked nothing in return but the chance to protect and provide. Bigfoot had been running from ghosts and found himself haunted instead by the living, by a woman who'd seen past his fearsome reputation to the gentleness underneath, by a child who'd never known him as anything but the father who sang her lullabies and carved her toys and made her feel safe in a world that could be cruel to the innocent. And in the end, perhaps that was the only redemption that mattered. Not the dramatic kind that came with fanfare and public recognition, but the quiet kind that happened one day at a time, one act of love at a time, one choice to stay and build rather than run and hide. As the stars emerged over their mountain valley and their daughters slept peacefully between them, Sarah and Bigfoot learned what their predecessors had known for generations, that home wasn't a place you found, but something you built together, one log at a time, one season at a time, one shared breath in the darkness until it became as permanent and unshakable as the mountains themselves.